I've had a movie playing in my head almost since I can remember. It's actually a memory, but it's not mine. It belonged to my mother and her family. It's the story of my Uncle Buddy. Now it's just a small town in upstate New York, but back in the 40s, Middletown was a thriving city. It had department stores and a newspaper, and a radio station. That's where my grandmother had a radio show. It's where my uncle was working when he died. When Buddy was 16, he started hosting a hit parade show, the Saturday Jamboree. Every week he got requests by the bagful, and all the kids knew who Buddy Murray was. And then the next year, on a Monday in September, he ended his life. My mother was 12, my aunt was 14. At school, they were told that their brother had an accident, and they went home to an empty house to wait. My mother never stopped trying to make sense of what happened that day, which is why the story started for me, the September I turned 10, sitting on the couch, hearing it from her for the first of many times. Buddy was supposed to meet my grandmother for lunch at the drugstore by the radio station, but instead, he went up to the roof. Someone saw him up there, and they called the police, and a large crowd quickly formed. The police and the fire department arrived, but they couldn't reason with him. As my grandmother was joining this crowd, he jumped. When I was about 17 and thereafter, my mom included other details in the story. She said there'd been a man at the station who'd taken Buddy out of town on overnight trips. I remember it felt like a warning. She was so afraid what happened to him was going to happen to me. The closer I got to 19, Buddy's age when he died, the more my mom thought that what happened to him was going to happen to me. But it was complicated. I didn't want to believe her story about the station manager, because the older I got, the closer I was getting to coming out myself. And if a gay man had caused my uncle to end his life, if a gay man had been the cause of so much grief, then what did that say for me? The night Buddy died, my grandfather rushed home from a business trip, but he was too emotional to make the necessary arrangements, so that task fell to my grandmother. It's not clear what happened or didn't happen next, except to say that by the end of that week, they hadn't done anything for him. The location of his final resting place was lost, to them and everyone. My grandfather's grief was absolute. Buddy's name could never be spoken in the house again. He couldn't be reminded, so they took his pictures off the walls, and they gave away his things. And suddenly, it was like he never existed. I started with the name of the last person who tried to help Buddy, the policeman, on the sidewalk that day in September. I sent an email to no one in particular at the Middletown police. I also tried the hospital where they took Buddy that morning, but it had been closed down for 30 years. Wall radio and all of its history had been destroyed in a fire in 1975. I decided to see if I could do better in person. It was actually my second trip to Middletown. On a cross-country car ride, we passed through Middletown the summer I was 10. I'll never forget being in the back seat of that station wagon, my mother gesturing out the window as my father slowed the car to a crawl. "And that's the building my brother jumped on," she said to us in the back seat. That night at the motel, I checked my email, and I'd gotten a reply from a detective at the Middletown police. It was the first amazing coincidence. He'd found the police blotter for 1947 while looking up cold cases in the basement the previous week. "Call me," he said. September 8, 1947 was sunny and warm in Middletown, New York. It was the first full week of school. My grandmother's advice show aired on Mondays at 11. Buddy was scheduled to announce the news at 2, and they had plans to meet at the drugstore for lunch. But instead of meeting my grandmother, Buddy went up to the roof of Wayland's and started pacing around. At 11:35, the phone rang at the police station 3 blocks away, and a Lieutenant Fallon picked up. The police blotter, which until the week before had been forgotten in the basement of the police station, told the story. "Received a call from an excited woman that a man was acting queer and standing on edge of roof on Wayland's building at the square. sent car. Patrolman Brown reported the man had jumped and fled to an ambulance. Notified Horton Hospital. Identified as Barton William Murray. In its day, Horton Hospital was a modern institution, its top-floor operating rooms illuminated by giant picture frame windows. That's where they took Buddy. But instead of performing exploratory surgery, they set his broken legs, and he died 3 hours later. When my grandmother was 84, my cousin interviewed her. He didn't ask her to recount what she witnessed that day, but later, in response to a question about her radio career and how it had ended, she offered this explanation of Buddy's death.
And that show to him was more important than life itself. You just see, he was terribly nervous. He was getting back in he was a high school kid, you know, getting back in his schoolwork, and up there they'd call him at any time to come, and he couldn't disappoint the director. Now that to me was more important to him than anything. What could he do? He couldn't be two places at once, and just had a complete nervous breakdown.
For the record, Buddy was 19, and he should have graduated the previous spring. But academic troubles had been trailing him for years, and his lack of a diploma had been weighing on him all summer. Had he returned to high school that morning? And was it really plausible that the wall program director could cause Buddy to end his life? Or was this an echo of my mother's story? My grandmother said that Buddy couldn't be in two places at once. At 19, I was having that two places feeling all the time. Ostensibly straight on the outside, definitely headed for gayness on the inside. I was depressed and just doing what I could to keep it all together. Buddy's mood had been worsening in the weeks before his death. He was behind in school now, and my grandfather wanted him to join the military. But in 1947, the armed services were ramping down on a colossal scale, and Buddy was an unlikely recruit. He had a hernia and had to wear a truss in high school. The hernia kept him out of the Army, so he had it repaired, but he still couldn't pass the physical. From the time I was a teenager, my mom's story always included the older man at the station. As a middle-aged man myself, now I had to wonder if he ever existed, or was he a mashup of my mother's trauma, a gay boogeyman. At the Middletown Historical Society, I found a set of directories from the 1940s. More than just the phone books of their day, the directories include every man's name, marital status, employer, and address. It didn't take me very long to make a list of all the men who had ever worked with Buddy at the station. I didn't grow up around my Aunt Dickie, and I'd never spoken to her about Buddy. But now she was the only person left who might be able to make sense of the list I'd just constructed. She was 14 when Buddy died. Older than my mom, she remembered more. Now she's 86, and her memories of that period are still very vivid. "I see his name on your list," she said, "and I know about what happened to him later." A few weeks before Buddy's death, Buddy's older sister invited him to come stay with her in Ithaca, hoping a change of scenery might cheer him up. But Buddy said he couldn't leave, he was just too busy at the station. The following week, the director of the station invited Buddy to spend Labor Day weekend with him, and perhaps others, in Wappingers Falls, a little town nearby. This time Buddy accepted. My grandmother also worked closely with this man, and no doubt she thought the trip away might do Buddy some good. The morning I left Middletown, I stopped by City Hall and put in a records request with the registrar. Then I drove out to Wappingers Falls. It's no resort town. More like a creek and a bridge at the end of Main Street. I think Buddy and the station director probably drove to a private home in the area, maybe to join others for a holiday house party. According to my aunt, when Buddy came back from this weekend, he had changed, and clearly he was in some kind of crisis. My grandmother grew worried, but then she was always a little worried, maybe like my mom was always a little worried about me. She asked him what had happened, but he wouldn't talk, and she didn't press it. Later that night, he took a book off the family bookshelf, and he wrote a single sentence on the inside cover. They didn't find it until many years later. Buddy wrote, "Never tell anyone what happened. I finally came out without too much fanfare at 27. 3 years later, I met my husband, and as the invitations to our backyard ceremony were heading in the mail, my mom thought it might be a good time to call Dickie and officially come out for me. But then she did something else. She told her that she thought Buddy had been gay too. When Dickie said she recognized the name of the station director, and also what happened to him later, I knew at once who she was referring to. Theodore Allen had been the general manager of WAL when my grandmother and Buddy first started there in 1944, and he died a grisly death, which had generated headlines for months afterward. Exactly a year after Buddy's death, the 54-year-old Mr. Allen was strangled in Albany by a 20-year-old soldier he'd met at the bus station. The soldier was caught 3 days later, confessed, and sentenced to life. My aunt was aware of this chapter as well, though I couldn't tell what she made of it. To see Mr. Allen's horrible fate as some sort of cosmic justice in connection to Buddy, I'd have to believe that Buddy's crisis was brought on by something Mr. Allen had done directly to him. But just coming out to yourself can be shattering, no matter how it's occasioned. In 1947, it may have also felt like a death sentence. Buddy's name wasn't in the local papers for a long time, until this notice appeared, September 8, 1987. It was my mother's work. My mom died in 2006. We found it among her things. She'd always wanted to get a headstone made for Buddy, but she didn't know where it would go. I hadn't asked Dickie how she knew it was Theodore Allen who took Buddy to Wappingers Falls. When I did, she said she wasn't sure, but she thought the story might have come from my mom. Buddy went away with the man who was running the station at the time. That's what she knew. But if that was the case, then they both had the wrong man. Mr. Allen hadn't worked at WAL in almost 2 years. I got back from Middletown, and I found this waiting for me. It's Buddy's death record from the town registrar. More complete than a death certificate, it also includes his burial information. Buddy's ashes had not been lost to time. They had been buried in the ground, without a marker, just 5 blocks from the radio station, and only 5 days later. His ashes were buried at Hillside Cemetery, in an unmarked location, somewhere within its 62 acres. In early 1946, a 29-year-old Marine Reserve named George Shepard became WAL Radio's new program director. He did everything at the station, writing and hosting shows, doing PR events, and planning the weekly schedules. My grandmother's interview when she was 84 resulted in a transcript of over 58,000 words, and in every instance, she refers to this man as either the director or program director. I believe that George was the director that my grandmother spoke of. Between his work at the tower and the studio, Buddy was in constant contact with the tireless George Shepard. Compare this to Mr. Allen, who hadn't been on the scene in almost 2 years and had no known relationship with Buddy at the time. It makes so much more sense that Buddy would agree to leave work and take a short holiday with George and perhaps his friends, and that my grandmother would have thought nothing of it. My aunt thinks that George stayed at my grandmother's side that entire horrifying day. He drove her to the hospital that afternoon to see Buddy one last time, and he drove his car behind hers all the way back to the farm that night. It was George who was standing next to my grandmother when she told my mom and my aunt the news about Buddy. Whatever feelings George and Buddy may or may not have had for each other, one thing was certain. George was no boogeyman. He was, by every account, an exceptionally honorable and benevolent person. A bachelor until the age of 92, he left behind many friends, and they still cherish his memory today. I got in contact with the man who runs the cemetery, and like so many businesses in Middletown, it's been in the family for generations. I asked about cremation records, and he said he had them all in his basement, But that night, he couldn't find anything for Barton Murray Jr. In 1947, they didn't keep track of ashes if there wasn't a marker to go with them. From the time she was 12, all my mom wanted to do was rewind the movie and get her brother back. She wasn't big enough or powerful enough to keep it from happening, but she could vow to never forget. And she could raise her kids with his memory, to know all the stories of his promising life, and not just his death. Last year, on a warm day in September, I met the man who runs Hillside at the gate, with Buddy's death record in hand, and he brought me here. He called it the back line because it's along the edge, and there are a number of them, roughly divided into decades, and then centuries. This place is so big. We walked along a line of headstones, reading dates out loud, starting from opposite ends, until we reached an empty spot in the middle, somewhere between 1946 and 47. He stopped and he said, "Here." It was the spot where he figured his grandfather had very likely buried Buddy's ashes 72 years ago. They say that memorials are for the living and not the dead. There may be some truth to that, but I think we made this for him. Finally. And for her.